Before they destroyed themselves, the Eldari ruled everything. Millions of years of perfection, and it still wasn't enough. They wanted more. They built a god from their own desires, and when it was born, it ate them. Trillions of souls screaming into the warp in a single moment. This is what happened when excess became divine. There are civilizations that rise and fall within the span of a star's lifetime. There are empires that burn brightly and collapse into ash before the echo of their first triumph fades. And then there are those that endure so long, grow so vast, that their death becomes inevitable not through conquest or cataclysm, but through the slow, inexorable rot of perfection itself. The Eldari were such an empire. Long before humanity crawled from the mud of ancient terror, before the first orc warbands tore across the stars, before even the Necrontyr surrendered their flesh to become the Undying, the Eldari stood as the uncontested masters of the galaxy. Theirs was not dominion earned through war, though they were capable of it. Theirs was not supremacy claimed through faith, though their gods walked among them. Theirs was the rule of those who had transcended necessity itself. They had bent reality to their will so completely that struggle became a memory, survival a forgotten concern, and existence itself a canvas upon which they could paint any desire. They had no need to toil. Their technologies were wonders that predated the Imperium's oldest relics, machines so advanced they seemed to operate not through circuitry and logic, but through the dreams of their makers. Wraithbone constructs grown from psychic intent rather than forged. Weapons that killed not with crude matter but with unraveling coherence. Ships that danced through the webway, an ancient network of tunnels carved through the spaces between reality, allowing them to traverse the galaxy without ever touching the void. They shaped worlds with thought. They extended lifespans into millennia. They gazed into the warp and saw not madness, but potential. For millions of years, they thrived. But all perfect things contain the seed of their undoing. The earliest generations of Eldari knew hardship. They fought the Necrontyr in the wars that would birth the Citan and see the galaxy bleed. They struggled against entropy and hostile Xenos and the raw chaos of an untamed universe. But with each victory, each advancement, that struggle diminished. With each generation, necessity retreated further. And in its absence, something else began to grow. Boredom. Not the simple restlessness of a child awaiting entertainment, but the existential hollowness that comes when every challenge has been overcome, every question answered, every frontier mapped. The Eldari had conquered death, bent matter, and walked among gods. What remained? At first, they turned to art. Entire worlds became galleries, symphonies that lasted centuries, sculptures carved from living stone that wept and sang. They pursued beauty with the same ferocity their ancestors had pursued survival, and for a time, it sustained them. But beauty, too, became routine. They turned to philosophy, to the exploration of consciousness itself, psychic disciplines that allowed them to perceive the thoughts of stars, to dream in colors that had no names, to experience existence from perspectives beyond mortal comprehension. They walked through memories as easily as corridors. They reshaped their own emotions, heightening joy, dulling sorrow, crafting inner worlds more vivid than the material realm. And still, it was not enough. So they pushed further. The great cities of the Eldari core worlds became labyrinths of indulgence. Towers of crystal and wraithbone reached towards skies painted in shades no human eye could perceive. Within those towers, pleasure became pursuit. Neural stimulators allowed experiences beyond the body's capacity. Entire districts were dedicated to sensation refined into sacrament. What began as appreciation became obsession. What began as exploration became addiction. They no longer created art, they consumed it. They no longer sought knowledge, they devoured it. Every experience had to surpass the last. Every sensation had to be sharper, deeper, more exquisite than the one before. Moderation became weakness. Restraint became failure. The society fractured slowly, like ice cracking across a frozen lake. Not all Eldari followed the path into decadence. There were those who saw the danger, who recognized the spiritual rot spreading through their civilization. These were the ones who would become the Exodites, those who abandoned the glory of the Empire for primitive worlds at the galaxy's edge. They traded psychic mastery for communion with world spirits, vast entities dwelling within virgin planets. They chose simplicity over sophistication, survival over supremacy. The rest of their kind mocked them as cowards, as regressive fools clinging to an imagined past. The core worlds had no need for such primitiveness. The core worlds had transcended such limitations. The core worlds did not understand that limitations are what keep the soul intact. In the great amphitheaters of the Eldari throne worlds, performances became rituals. Actors no longer portrayed emotion, they induced it, broadcast it, forced audiences to experience sensation directly through psychic link. A tragedy was no longer watched, it was felt, lived, endured as if the suffering were your own. A romance was not observed, it was consumed, the participants' ecstasy flooding through the minds of thousands. The crowds grew larger, the experiences grew more intense, and the boundaries between performer and audience, between observer and participant, began to blur. There were those who spent months locked in neural cradles, experiencing lifetimes of sensation compressed into heartbeats. There were cults dedicated to the refinement of pain, not as punishment, but as art form, their practitioners seeking the perfect agony the way a sculptor seeks the perfect curve. There were pleasure districts where Eldari wandered like ghosts, their minds so fractured by overstimulation that they could no longer distinguish memory from reality, fantasy from flesh, and through it all, in the space beyond space, in the roiling nightmare realm of the Imperium, something began to stir. The warp is not empty. It has never been empty. It is a reflection of the material universe, a dimension of thought and emotion given form. Every fear, every joy, every moment of rage or love or despair ripples through the warp like a stone cast into water. For most species, these ripples are faint, barely perceptible. But the Eldari were psychically potent beyond measure. Their every thought burned bright in the Imperium. Their emotions were storms, and now those storms were converging. Excess breeds excess. Obsession feeds obsession. With every indulgence, with every boundary shattered in pursuit of sensation, the Eldari were pouring energy into the warp. Not consciously, not deliberately, but inevitably. The Imperium began to coalesce around their collective desires, their hungers, their endless, insatiable need for more. A shadow formed in the deep warp, shapeless at first, formless, but growing. The seers were the first to notice. Those Eldari gifted with foresight, who could peer through time's veil and perceive futures yet unwritten. They began to experience visions that left them screaming, dreams of something vast and hungry, something that wore their own faces, something that whispered in voices they recognized as their own. They saw cities consumed not by fire but by ecstasy. They saw souls unraveling into strands of pleasure and agony indistinguishable from one another. They tried to warn the others. No one listened. Why would they? The seers had always been prone to dramatic pronouncements. Their warnings had grown increasingly apocalyptic over the centuries, yet the Empire endured. The pleasures continued. Life, such as it was, went on. The cults grew bolder. What had once been hidden in shadowed districts now spilled into the open. Processions of devotees wandered the streets, their bodies modified into living art, their minds lost to sensation. Entire cities became theaters of the grotesque, where morality was a relic and restraint a myth. Rival factions competed not for resources or territory, but for the perfection of experience. One cult sought to induce every possible emotion simultaneously. Another pursued the eradication of all feeling, believing that numbness was the final frontier. A third declared that only through the complete dissolution of self could true enlightenment be achieved. They were all correct. They were all damned. The aristocracy, the rulers who had once guided the Eldari with wisdom earned over millennia, now presided over courts where policy was determined by whim and decree was indistinguishable from depravity. Laws were rewritten daily, then discarded. Hierarchies dissolved. The very concept of governance became performance art. Entire councils convened solely to experience the sensation of power, then dissolved when the novelty faded. On some worlds, Order collapsed entirely. Anarchy reigned, not as chaos, but as liberation. The Eldari celebrated it. They danced through burning streets, their laughter echoing through the ruins of their own civilization, convinced that they had finally transcended the tyranny of structure. They did not see the irony. They had become slaves to sensation, prisoners of their own freedom. In the webway, travelers began to report strange phenomena. Sections of the ancient tunnels that had always been stable now flickered with instability. Walls wept with colors that should not exist. Whispers echoed through corridors that had been silent for millennia. Some travelers arrived at their destinations changed, their eyes bright with something that was not quite madness, their smiles too wide, their laughter too sharp. The webway had always been a sanctuary, isolated from the warp's tumult. But now, the barriers were thinning. The shadow in the deep warp was pressing against reality, seeking ingress, hungry for birth. Still, the Eldari did not stop, could not stop. The addiction had metastasized beyond individual choice. It had become cultural, existential. To deny the pursuit of sensation was to deny what they had become, and they had no memory of what they had been. Artistic movements arose that celebrated destruction as the ultimate creation. Entire populations volunteered to be dismantled. Their bodies and minds rendered into components for living sculptures that screamed in harmonies no ear should perceive. Temples were raised to concepts that had no names, deities of pure sensation worshipped through acts that defied description. The old gods watched. Kain, the bloody-handed, god of war and murder. Isha, the goddess of healing and fertility. Vol, the smith. Lilith, the maiden of dreams. They had walked among the Eldari once, revered and loved. Now they were distant, their voices drowned beneath the roar of excess. Some say the gods tried to intervene. Others claim they had already foreseen the end and withdrawn, powerless to prevent what their children had set in motion. Only Segorach, the laughing god, seemed to understand the true horror of what approached. His followers, the Harlequins, began their preparations, though for what, none could say. The final years before the fall were a descent painted in lurid colors. Worlds that had stood for millions of years crumbled not through invasion but through internal collapse. Psychic storms raged through the warp, bleeding into real space with increasing frequency. Entire star systems reported visions, mass hallucinations, populations gripped by inexplicable compulsions. The seers no longer warned, they wept. Those who had retained sanity fled to the edges of the Empire, seeking refuge among the Exodites or aboard the craft worlds, massive vessels that had once been merchant ships and now became arks for the desperate and the faithful. These refugees brought tales of cities where time no longer flowed correctly, where the living and the dead mingled in streets that existed in multiple states simultaneously, where reality itself had grown thin as parchment. On one world, an entire population awoke to find they had forgotten what they were. They wandered through their cities like sleepwalkers, performing rituals they could not name, speaking in languages they did not recognize. When rescuers arrived, they found only silence. The population had not died, they had simply stopped. Their bodies remained animate, their minds hollowed out, leaving only the faintest echo of what they had been. On another, the sky bled, not metaphorically. The atmosphere itself took on the consistency of liquid, raining down in viscous streams that dissolved everything they touched. The survivors claimed the rain sang, that it knew their names, that it promised wonders beyond comprehension if only they would surrender. Most did. In the final days, even those who had indulged most deeply began to feel it. A presence, vast and patient, hungry and impossibly ancient despite not yet existing. It pressed against the veil between warp and reality like a child pressing against a womb, eager for birth. Some Eldari tried to flee. They boarded ships and dove into the webway, seeking escape to the galaxy's farthest reaches. Some succeeded, most did not. The webway was no longer safe. Entire passages collapsed, trapping travelers in spaces between spaces. Others opened onto vistas of impossible geometry, realms that existed only in nightmare, where physics was suggestion and sanity an illusion. The craft worlds accelerated their evacuation. millions crammed aboard vessels designed for thousands. Entire clans abandoned wealth accumulated over millennia, taking only what they could carry. They did not know what they were fleeing, only that remaining meant annihilation. The Exodites, isolated on their distant worlds, felt the tremors through the world's spirits. The great entities dwelling within their planets stirred, troubled by dreams that were not their own. The Exodites prepared rituals of binding and warding, ancient rites half forgotten, hoping that distance and simplicity would shield them from whatever was coming. It would not be enough. Nothing would be enough. In the final hours, those who remained in the core worlds experienced a collective hallucination. The sky opened, not physically, spiritually, psychically. They looked up and saw the warp bleeding through, saw the shadow that had been growing for centuries finally take shape. It was beautiful. It was horrifying. It was everything they had ever desired and everything they had ever feared given form and hunger, and it smiled. The seers, those few who retained enough sanity to perceive what approached, recorded their final visions. Fragments survive, inscribed on spirit stones, whispered through the infinity circuits of the craft worlds. They speak of a presence so vast it defied comprehension. They speak of a hunger that could never be sated. They speak of a god born not from worship but from excess itself, a deity crafted from every indulgence, every obsession, every moment of pleasure pursued beyond reason. They speak of Slaanesh. The name would not be spoken for centuries. The Eldari had no word for what they had created. How could they? It was themselves, refined and distilled, all that they had become, given divine form. It was their reflection, their child, their doom, and it was hungry. The final night, if it can be called night, in a realm where time had already begun to fracture, was silent. The great cities stood empty, their inhabitants lost to rapture or fled into hiding. The streets were littered with discarded treasures, artifacts of incalculable value, abandoned by those who finally understood that no possession mattered. The towers of crystal and wraithbone hummed with residual psychic energy, echoing with the ghosts of a million moments of excess. In the warp, the shadow coalesced. The birth was imminent, and the galaxy, unknowing, held its breath. The Eldari had reached the apex of civilization. They had transcended mortality, conquered entropy, and bent reality itself to their will. They had achieved everything a species could aspire to achieve, and in doing so, they had doomed themselves to birth the very thing that would feast upon their souls for eternity. The empire of endless bloom stood on the precipice, beautiful and rotten, glorious and damned. The final grains of sand slipped through the hourglass. The moment approached, and in the deep warp, something vast and terrible opened its eyes for the first time. There are deaths that come swiftly, mercifully. A blade through the heart, a ship's reactor breach, the sudden silence of a stopped pulse, and then there are deaths that stretch across eternities, where every moment of dissolution is felt, recorded, experienced in excruciating clarity. The fall was not swift. It began with a sound that was not a sound, a vibration that originated not in the material universe but in the realm of thought and emotion, the space between spaces where consciousness bleeds into reality. Those sensitive to the warp heard it first. A note, singular, perfect, impossibly high and impossibly low simultaneously. It resonated through every psyker's mind like a tuning fork struck against the base of the skull. The seers aboard the craft worlds collapsed. Blood streamed from their eyes, their ears, their mouths. They convulsed, their bodies rejecting what their minds were forced to perceive. Some never woke. Those who did spoke in fragments, their words tumbling over each other in desperate urgency. It is here. It is born. It is us. In the core worlds of the Eldari Empire, reality shuddered. The sky, already strange with warp bleed and psychic storm, began to ripple. Colors that had no names bled across the heavens. Shapes moved behind the veil of existence, pressing against the fabric of the material realm like hands against silk. The boundary between warp and real space, already thinned by millennia of excess, began to tear. Not gradually, not slowly. It ruptured. The first worlds to die experienced it as ecstasy. Populations looked up as the sky split open, revealing something beyond that their minds could not process. But their souls understood. Every neuron fired at once, every synapse ignited. Pleasure and agony merged into a singular, overwhelming sensation that transcended both. They screamed, they laughed, they wept, and as they did, their souls were pulled free from their bodies like thread unspooling from cloth. Trillions of Aeldari stood frozen, their eyes wide, their mouths open in expressions that could have been rapture or terror. Their bodies remained upright for heartbeats, minutes, hours. Time had lost meaning. And then, slowly, they collapsed, empty, hollow. The soul, that spark of consciousness and identity that made them who they were, had been consumed. The newborn god fed. Slaanesh erupted into existence, not through gradual manifestation but through violent, orgasmic birth. The deity was not created. It had always been inevitable, gestating in the warp's depths, formed from millions of years of Aeldari excess. But now, in this moment, it crossed the threshold from potential to actual, from shadow to substance, from hunger to manifestation, and the hunger was infinite. The psychic shockwave rippled outward from the Aeldari core worlds at speeds that defied comprehension. It was not bound by the laws of physics. It moved through the warp itself, which meant it moved through thought, through emotion, through every psychically sensitive being in the galaxy. Navigators aboard human vessels, still primitive and scattered across distant stars, screamed as their third eyes burst with visions of something vast and terrible and beautiful being born. Orc weird boys detonated in green fire, their minds unable to contain the psychic pressure. Even the Hrud, those time-displaced scavengers, felt the tremor and fled deeper into their warrens. But for the Aeldari, there was no fleeing. Their souls burned brighter than any other species. Their psychic presence was a beacon, a lighthouse calling across the Imperium, and Slaanesh, newborn and ravenous, turned its attention toward that light, with the inevitability of a predator toward prey. The god reached. On worlds across the Empire's heart, Aeldari felt the touch. It was not gentle. It was violation and invitation fused, a caress that flayed, a whisper that demanded. It promised everything they had ever wanted. Every sensation refined to perfection, every experience elevated beyond mortal capacity. Pleasure without end, knowledge without limitation, existence transcendent and eternal. All they had to do was surrender. Most did not have a choice. Their souls were already stained by centuries of excess, already resonant with the energies that comprised Slaanesh's essence. The god did not need to ask permission. It simply claimed what was, in a sense, already its own. They were pulled, screaming into the warp, drawn toward the nascent deity like iron to lodestone, their consciousness shredded and absorbed into the growing maelstrom of divine hunger. But there were those who resisted, those whose souls, through discipline or luck or sheer stubborn will, remained tethered to their flesh. They experienced the fall not as annihilation, but as prolonged torment. They felt Slaanesh pulling at them, felt their souls beginning to unravel, felt the god's presence in their minds like a lover's breath against their neck and a predator's teeth at their throat. Some begged, some fought, some simply endured, frozen in the moment between life and damnation, unable to escape but not yet consumed. The craft worlds fled. These massive vessels, each a city unto itself, had already begun their evacuation in the years before the fall. Now they accelerated, diving deep into the webway, activating drives that pushed reality's boundaries. Behind them, the Empire burned, not with fire, with annihilation. Entire star systems winked out of existence, not destroyed but consumed, pulled wholesale into the warp as the barrier collapsed. Aboard the craft worlds, the survivors huddled in terror. They could feel it, even through the webway's protective isolation. The birth of She Who Thirsts, though that name would not be spoken for generations. They felt every Aeldari soul consumed like a phantom limb severed. They felt the collective psychic scream of their entire species being devoured. Some went mad, others wept. A few simply stared into nothing, their minds unable to process the magnitude of what had occurred. Infinity circuits, the psychic repositories where Eldari stored the souls of their dead, blazed with activity. The ancestors screamed warnings. They begged the living to run faster, to flee further. They knew, even in death, that Slaanesh's hunger would not be sated by the living alone. The god wanted everything, every soul, every echo, every fragment of consciousness that bore the Eldari's psychic signature. On the craft world Ulthwé, which had been furthest from the Empire's core, the seers gathered in the dome of crystal seers. They linked their minds, pooling their foresight in a desperate attempt to perceive a path forward. What they saw drove 3 of them into catatonia. The others emerged with expressions of such profound despair that no words were necessary. One seer spoke. Her voice was hollow, drained of all inflection. "We are claimed. All of us. Forever." In Camorra, the hidden city deep within the webway, the Eldari who had become the Drukhari experienced the fall differently. They were isolated, shielded by layers of reality and the webway's labyrinthine structure. But they felt the pull nonetheless. They felt their souls beginning to wither, felt something vast and hungry turning its attention toward them. In that moment of existential terror, they discovered a horrifying truth. Pain could anchor them, suffering, inflicted upon others, could sustain their souls. The agony of lesser beings, consumed and savored, could temporarily sate the god's hunger. It was not salvation. It was postponement, a stay of execution that required constant renewal, constant cruelty, constant feeding. They accepted it without hesitation. Survival demanded any price. Camorra's arenas, already venues of blood sport, transformed into theaters of industrial torture. The Drukhari began their long practice of raiding real space, stealing victims not for resources or slaves, but for the raw essence of suffering those victims could provide. They learned to prolong death, to extract maximum agony from each soul before discarding the husk. They became artists of cruelty, not from sadism alone, but from necessity. The alternative was Slaanesh. On the Exodite worlds, far from the Empire's heart, the survivors experienced the fall as distant thunder. The world's spirits, those vast planetary consciousnesses the Exodites had bonded with, shuddered. They screamed in frequencies that made mountains crack and oceans boil. The Exodites, linked to their world spirits through generations of symbiosis, felt every tremor. They performed rituals of binding, pouring their own psychic energy into the world's spirits, anchoring their souls to something older and more fundamental than themselves. It worked, barely. The world's spirits held became barriers against Slaanesh's pull, but the cost was immense. Many Exodites died in the binding, their life force consumed to reinforce the wards. Those who survived knew they could never leave their worlds. To step beyond the world spirit's embrace was to expose themselves to she who thirsts. They had chosen exile generations before. Now that exile was absolute. In the material realm, the Eye of Terror opened. Where once the Eldari core worlds had stood, now there was only a wound. A massive rift in space-time, a region where the warp and real space had merged so completely that neither could be said to exist independently. It was not a void. It was an excess of existence, a place where reality was too real, where the laws of physics were suggestions, and the boundary between thought and matter dissolved. Stars within the eye burned with colors they should not possess. Planets drifted in impossible orbits. Daemons, those creatures born of pure warp stuff, walked openly in what had once been material space. And at the center of it all, Slaanesh's palace began to coalesce, a structure of such perverse beauty that to perceive it was to feel desire and revulsion in equal, overwhelming measure. The galaxy reeled. Nascent civilizations, barely aware of the warp's existence, felt the psychic shockwave and interpreted it through their cultural lenses. Some species experienced mass visions of paradise lost, others saw prophecies of doom, a few, those unlucky enough to be psychically sensitive and close to the eye's formation, simply went extinct, their minds unable to withstand the pressure. Humanity, scattered and primitive across isolated worlds, barely noticed. Their psychers were rare and weak, their warp presence was dim. They would not understand what had occurred for millennia, but the seeds of future enmity were planted. The great enemy, as the Imperium would eventually name the Chaos Gods, had grown by one. And this new god was perhaps the most insidious, for it offered not conquest or decay or scheming, but the promise of perfection itself. The Aeldari pantheon, those gods who had walked beside the Aeldari for millions of years, faced annihilation. Slaanesh consumed most of them in the first moments of existence. They were, after all, constructs of the Aeldari's collective psyche, powerful but ultimately dependent on their worshippers. With those worshippers dying in their trillions, the gods had no anchor. Kaini, the god of war, shattered. His essence broke into fragments, scattered across the craft worlds in the form of avatars, towering constructs of molten metal and divine rage. He survived, but diminished, a shadow of what he had been. Isha, goddess of fertility and healing, was seized by Nurgle, the plague god, who claimed her as a prisoner and trophy. She remains there still, locked in his garden, forced to test his diseases for eternity. Vol, the smith god, dissolved into the warp's depths, his fate uncertain. Some say he endures in the hammers of the Aeldari's greatest artisans. Others claim he was devoured whole. Lilith, Morai Heg, Kurnus, each met their own ends, their divine essence consumed or scattered, their worship extinguished in the birthing scream. Only Segurach escaped unscathed. The laughing god danced between the cracks of reality, mocking Slaanesh even as the newborn deity reached for him. He vanished into the webway's deepest recesses, taking his servants, the Harlequins, with him. They would endure, keepers of memory and mockery, performing the stories of the fall for generations yet unborn, ensuring the Aeldari never forgot their shame. In the eye of terror, Slaanesh settled into existence like a predator into a fresh kill. The god was not satisfied, could never be satisfied. The Aeldari souls, countless trillions, were merely the first course of an infinite feast. The deity's hunger extended beyond its creators. It saw the galaxy entire as potential sustenance. Every sensation, every obsession, every moment of excess or perfection pursued beyond reason fed Slaanesh's essence. The other chaos gods acknowledged the newcomer with mixed reactions. Khorne, the blood god, regarded Slaanesh with contempt. Where Khorne valued strength and martial honor, Slaanesh embodied decadence and indulgence. Their enmity was immediate and eternal. Nurgle, the plague father, saw Slaanesh as both rival and kindred spirit. Where Nurgle offered acceptance of decay, Slaanesh offered transcendence through sensation. Both promised escape from suffering. Both demanded absolute devotion. They would vie for mortal souls across the millennia. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, alone seemed amused. Slaanesh's birth had rewritten the galaxy's destiny, opened new possibilities, new schemes. The changer of ways welcomed the chaos, the uncertainty. Another player on the board meant more opportunities for manipulation. But the Chaos God's politics were incomprehensible to mortals. What mattered, in the material realm, was that the galaxy had changed fundamentally and irrevocably. The warp storms that had already plagued the galaxy intensified. Travel became treacherous. Entire sectors were cut off, isolated by warp turbulence that made navigation impossible. The nascent Imperium of man, still in its infancy, would spend centuries clawing toward unity, hampered by the very roots between stars becoming death traps. And everywhere, in every corner of the galaxy, Slaanesh's influence began to seep. Not overtly, not immediately, but inevitably. Every artist who pursued their craft beyond sanity, every warrior who sought the perfect kill, every scholar who unraveled themselves in search of forbidden knowledge, every soul that confused obsession with passion, desire with need, became a potential offering to she who thirsts. The fall had lasted only moments in objective time. But for those who experienced it, for the Aeldari survivors who felt their entire civilization consumed, it was an eternity compressed into a single scream. The craft worlds drifted through the webway, silent and stunned. Entire clans had been wiped out, families shattered. The survivors clutched their spirit stones, those small gems that would capture their souls upon death and prevent Slaanesh from claiming them. They whispered prayers to gods who no longer answered. They wept for a civilization that had endured for millions of years and died in the span of a heartbeat. On the Exodite worlds, mourning rituals lasted for years. They sang dirges to the fallen, knowing that those souls would never rest, never reincarnate, never know peace. They had been consumed, digested, made part of the god their own species had birthed through arrogance and excess. In Komara, there was no mourning, only the sharp, manic laughter of those who understood they had escaped annihilation by the narrowest margin and would spend eternity running from it. They threw themselves into debauchery and cruelty with renewed fervor, not from joy but from terror. Every moment of stolen suffering was another moment of survival. Every scream they extracted was another second. Slaanesh's hunger turned elsewhere. The galaxy had birthed a new god, and that god wore the face of the civilization it had destroyed, smiled with their smile, hungered with their hunger. Slaanesh was the Aeldari's reflection, their ultimate achievement and their eternal damnation. The fall was complete, the birth was finished. And in the spaces between reality, in the warp's roiling depths, a voice that was all voices whispered across the void. More. The hunger was infinite. The feast had only begun. And every soul in the galaxy, knowingly or not, had become potential prey for she who thirsts. The Aeldari had reached for perfection and found damnation. They had birthed a god and doomed themselves to feed it for eternity. The empire was ash. The glory was gone. All that remained was survival, hollow and desperate, and the knowledge that even death offered no escape. The eye of terror gazed upon the galaxy, unblinking and patient. Within it, Slaanesh smiled and waited. There are gods born from worship, shaped by prayer and devotion into forms their followers can comprehend. There are gods inherited from older ages, their origins lost to time, their nature fixed and immutable. And then there is Slaanesh, a deity born from indulgence itself, whose very existence is defined not by what it is, but by what it desires. In the aftermath of birth, the Prince of Pleasure did not rest, could not rest. Rest implied satisfaction, and satisfaction was anathema to a being whose essence was hunger refined into divinity. The Eye of Terror became its domain, but domain is too simple a word for what Slaanesh created. The Eye was not conquered or claimed. It was shaped, molded, transformed into a reflection of its master's nature. Where once Aeldari worlds had orbited stable stars according to predictable laws, now there existed only the realm of excess, a dimension where reality bent to desire and physics was merely one option among infinite possibilities. The palaces began to grow, not constructed, grown. They emerged from the fabric of the warp itself like crystalline formations, structures of impossible geometry that defied three-dimensional comprehension, towers that spiraled upward and inward simultaneously, gardens where the flowers screamed in pleasure when touched, halls whose walls were woven from sensation itself, where to press your hand against the surface was to experience every emotion you had ever felt compressed into a single overwhelming moment. The architecture was beautiful beyond description and horrifying beyond measure. Beauty and horror, after all, are merely different frequencies of the same overwhelming stimulus. At the heart of this realm stood the Palace of Pleasure, Slaanesh's primary seat of power within the warp. To describe it accurately would require senses mortals do not possess and perceptions reality does not allow. Those few who have glimpsed it and retained sanity speak in fragments, contradictions. They describe walls that weep perfume and bleed honey, floors that feel like silk and taste like copper, corridors that extend forever and arrive instantly, music that can be seen, colors that can be heard, touches that exist only as memory and anticipation fused. The palace was not designed for function, it was designed for experience. Every surface, every angle, every threshold existed to provoke sensation. To walk its halls was to be assaulted by stimuli from all directions, each one perfectly calibrated to overwhelm, to seduce, to break down the boundaries between self and sensation until the two became indistinguishable. And throughout the palace, Slaanesh's first servants began to take form. Daemons are not born, they coalesce. They are emotion and desire given substance, fragments of their patron god's nature granted independent existence. Slaanesh's daemons emerged from the raw stuff of the warp, shaped by the god's hunger and the echoes of Eldari excess that had birthed it. The Keepers of Secrets came first. These towering entities stood as the Dark Prince's greatest champions, each one a perfected predator designed to embody a different aspect of excess. Some were beautiful beyond reason, their forms crafted to inspire desire so intense it became painful. Others were horrifying, their features twisted into configurations that should not exist yet possessed an undeniable aesthetic appeal. All of them radiated an aura of overwhelming presence, a psychic pressure that made mortals feel simultaneously elevated and diminished in their company. They were given names that mortals could not pronounce without risking madness. Names that resonated in frequencies beyond sound, that existed as concepts rather than words. To speak a Keeper of Secrets' true name was to invoke it, to draw its attention across the gulf between warp and reality, to invite catastrophe draped in silk. Each keeper possessed its own obsession, its own refined pursuit of perfection. One sought the perfect death, studying every method of killing until it could end a life with such precision that the victim felt only ecstasy as their soul departed. Another pursued absolute beauty, stealing faces and forms from across the galaxy, grafting them onto itself in an endless quest for aesthetic transcendence. A third collected experiences, forcing its victims to live through every sensation possible before consuming their souls as the final course of an infinite meal. They were generals and artists both, leading Slaanesh's hosts while simultaneously pursuing their own incomprehensible goals. Beneath the keepers came the daemonettes, lesser manifestations of Slaanesh's nature but no less deadly for their rank. They appeared as slender, androgynous figures whose beauty was marred by subtle wrongness, too many fingers on each hand, each digit ending in a razor claw, eyes that reflected desire back at the observer, voices that promised everything while delivering only damnation. They moved with predatory grace, their every gesture calculated to attract and horrify in equal measure. The daemonettes were sirens, tempters, harvesters of sensation. They did not kill through brute force but through seduction, through the slow erosion of will and sanity, until their victims begged for the release only consumption could provide. They whispered in the ears of artists and scholars, warriors and kings, always offering the same bargain in different words: surrender, experience, transcend. The price was never mentioned until far too late. Other daemon forms emerged as well. The fiends of Slaanesh, bestial entities that galloped on multiple legs, their bodies a fusion of predator and prey, beauty and monstrosity. They hunted not for sustenance but for the joy of the hunt itself, pursuing victims across real space and warp alike with single-minded obsession. Their mere presence induced euphoria in those they chased, a psychic poison that made flight feel like ecstasy and capture like consummation. Seekers rode upon steeds of Slaanesh, demonic mounts whose serpentine bodies undulated with hypnotic grace. These cavalry units swept across battlefields not to conquer but to experience, their riders savoring every clash of blade, every scream, every moment of violence refined into art. And everywhere throughout Slaanesh's realm, lesser daemons swarmed, formless things that existed as pure sensation, swarms of entities that fed on specific emotions, each one a specialized parasite designed to extract a particular flavor of excess. There were demons of pride, of vanity, of obsession, of despair. Each represented a facet of Slaanesh's infinite hunger, a fragment of the god's nature made manifest. The hierarchy was not rigid. Slaanesh did not rule through order but through inspiration. The daemons competed with each other not for rank but for their patron's fleeting attention, each trying to create experiences so exquisite, sensations so refined, that the Dark Prince would notice and grant them a moment of favor. That favor was worth any price. To be acknowledged by she who thirsts was to experience existence at its most intense, a sensation that made all other experiences pale into insignificance. Daemons would betray each other, destroy each other, unmake themselves entirely for the possibility of that recognition. It was, in its own way, a perfect reflection of the Eldari society that had birthed their god. But Slaanesh's influence extended beyond the warp. The god's hunger could not be contained within the Eye of Terror, no matter how vast that realm became. Excess existed everywhere. Obsession was a universal constant. Every sapient species, every thinking being, possessed the capacity for the pursuit that transcends reason. And Slaanesh was patient. In the material galaxy, the first mortal cults began to form, not through deliberate recruitment or missionary work, but through the simple inevitability of desire. An artist on a hive world, frustrated by the limitations of their craft, began to experiment with techniques that incorporated pain as pigment, screams as texture. They did not know they were worshipping. They only knew that their work had never felt so alive. A warrior on a feudal world, obsessed with perfecting their swordsmanship, began to kill not for duty, but for the beauty of the cut itself. They studied each death, refined their technique, sought the perfect angle, the ideal pressure, the transcendent moment when blade and flesh became one. They did not pray to Slaanesh, but their devotion fed the god nonetheless. A scholar in an isolated monastery uncovered texts that should have remained buried, forbidden knowledge that promised understanding beyond mortal comprehension. They read. They studied. They descended into obsession, their pursuit of knowledge consuming everything else until only the hunger for more remained. By the time they realized what they had become, it was far too late. Slaanesh did not demand worship. The god simply waited for mortals to pursue anything beyond reason, beyond restraint. The nature of the pursuit mattered less than its intensity. Excellence could become excess. Passion could become obsession. Desire could become hunger that consumed the desirer whole. This was Slaanesh's true insidiousness. Khorne's followers knew they served blood and slaughter. Nurgle's chosen understood they embraced decay. Tzeentch's pawns at least suspected they were part of some greater scheme. But Slaanesh's victims often never realized they had fallen until damnation was complete. They told themselves they were artists, perfectionists, dedicated to their craft. They told themselves their pursuit was noble, their obsession justified. They were wrong. The other Chaos Gods observed Slaanesh's consolidation with varying degrees of interest and hostility. Khorne, ever straightforward, hated the Prince of Pleasure with simple, direct fury. Where Khorne valued strength and martial prowess, Slaanesh represented indulgence and weakness. The Blood God's daemons clashed with Slaanesh's hosts wherever they met, their battles painted in crimson and violet, honor and excess locked in eternal conflict. Khorne roared his contempt across the warp, declaring Slaanesh a pretender, a false god born from weakness rather than forged in conflict. His followers echoed this sentiment. To them, Slaaneshi cultists were the worst kind of degenerates, warriors who had abandoned strength for sensation, who sought pleasure rather than glory. The irony that both gods ultimately demanded the same thing, absolute devotion to a single obsessive pursuit, was lost on Khorne's servants. Nuance was not their strength. Nurgle regarded Slaanesh with the patience of entropy itself. The Plague Father understood that all things decay, all beauty fades, all sensation eventually dulls. Where Slaanesh offered transcendence through experience, Nurgle offered peace through acceptance. Their philosophies were opposed yet complementary, two answers to the same question of existence's suffering. Nurgle's plagues and Slaanesh's temptations competed for the same souls, particularly those experiencing physical or spiritual anguish. The diseased might seek escape through sensation, trying to feel anything other than their rot. The pleasure seekers might eventually exhaust all sensation and find strange comfort in Nurgle's promise that decay is merely transformation, that accepting ruin brings its own form of contentment. The Father of Plagues did not hate Slaanesh. He simply waited. All excess eventually consumes itself. When Slaanesh's followers had experienced everything possible and found it hollow, Nurgle would be there, offering rest. Tzeentch alone seemed to appreciate Slaanesh's existence as opportunity rather than threat. The architect of fate saw the newborn god as another variable in the great game, another piece on a board of infinite complexity. Slaanesh's birth had rewritten destiny, creating new possibilities, new futures to manipulate and explore. Tzeentch's schemes often involved Slaanesh's servants, not as allies but as tools. A carefully placed temptation here, a whispered promise there, and Slaaneshi cultists would unknowingly serve the changer of ways' incomprehensible plans. Tzeentch found particular amusement in corrupting those who thought themselves above temptation, in using Slaanesh's nature against itself. The architect wove plots within plots, each one using the Dark Prince's hunger as a thread in a larger tapestry only Tzeentch could perceive. But these divine conflicts were abstract, incomprehensible to mortals. What mattered in the material realm was that Slaanesh had established itself as the fourth pillar of chaos, the final piece of the ruinous powers. Where once there had been 3 gods competing for mortal devotion, now there were 4. And this fourth god was perhaps the most dangerous, for it did not present itself as obviously malevolent. Khorne demanded blood. His nature was clear. Nurgle spread plague. His purpose was obvious. Tzeentch schemed and mutated. His treachery was expected. But Slaanesh offered perfection, excellence, the refinement of skill into art, the elevation of experience beyond mortal limitation. These were not inherently evil propositions. They were aspirations every sentient being could understand. Only later, when the pursuit had consumed everything else, when obsession had replaced identity, did the truth become clear. By then, escape was impossible. The soul was already claimed, already marinated in the very excess that comprised Slaanesh's essence. To die was merely to complete the journey, to be pulled into the warp and added to the god's endless feast. In the eye of terror, the palace of pleasure continued to grow, expanding with each soul consumed, each sensation experienced, each moment of excess anywhere in the galaxy. It was not static architecture but living hunger given form. New wings emerged to house new obsessions. Gardens bloomed with flowers that sang the dying breaths of those who had pursued beauty beyond sanity. Amphitheaters staged performances that had no beginning or end. Actors and audience merged into a singular experience of perpetual climax without release. Slaanesh walked these halls, though walked is too simple a term. The god existed everywhere and nowhere within its domain simultaneously. It was the palace and the presence within it, the hunger and the hunted, the seducer and the seduced. To enter Slaanesh's realm was to encounter the god in every surface, every scent, every sensation. Those mortals unfortunate enough to be pulled into this realm, their souls claimed before their time, experienced existence as eternal consumption. They were not tortured, not in the traditional sense. They were experienced, savored. Their every memory, every sensation they had ever felt, was extracted and refined and replayed and consumed in cycles without end. They became part of Slaanesh's being. Their identity dissolved into the god's infinite appetite. Some found this horrifying, others found it transcendent. Most found it both, the distinction between horror and ecstasy meaningless in a realm where all sensation was absolute. The architecture of excess was complete, not in the sense of being finished, but in the sense of being self-sustaining. Slaanesh had established its domain, forged its hosts, and set in motion the slow corruption that would claim victims across the galaxy for millennia to come. The god did not need to actively recruit. It simply needed to exist, a constant temptation, a promise of transcendence, always waiting for those who would pursue anything beyond the bounds of reason. And mortals, in their weakness and their strength, their desperation and their ambition, would always pursue, always reach, always hunger for more. This was the genius of Slaanesh's nature. The god had not imposed itself upon reality through conquest. It had made itself inevitable through the simple fact of existence. As long as sentient beings could desire, could obsess, could confuse passion with madness and call it devotion, Slaanesh would endure. The palace grew, the hosts multiplied, the hunger deepened, and across the galaxy, in every corner where thinking beings dwelt, the seeds of excess lay waiting. Some would sprout immediately, others would take centuries to bloom, but all would eventually flower into the same inevitable conclusion. damnation draped in silk and promise, annihilation perfumed and beautiful, the slow, exquisite dissolution of self into sensation, identity into experience, soul into sustenance for a god that could never, would never be satisfied. Slaanesh had arrived. The architecture was established, the feast was endless, and the god smiled, patient and eternal, knowing that time was irrelevant when hunger was infinite. There are survivors who endure through strength, who weather catastrophe through will and emerge unbowed. There are survivors who persist through luck, random chance sparing them when all logic suggests they should have perished. And then there are the Eldari survivors of the fall, who endure through methods that are neither strength nor fortune, but something closer to perpetual self-mutilation, an existence defined entirely by what they have lost, and what still hungers for them. The Eldari did not survive the fall. They postponed it. Every member of the species, from the moment of birth until the instant of death, exists under a singular, inescapable truth. Slaanesh owns them, not metaphorically, not symbolically. The god has already claimed their souls, already written their names in the ledger of the damned. Death is not an ending but a transition, a moment when the fragile barrier of flesh finally fails, and the soul, that luminous essence of self, is pulled screaming into the warp to feed she who thirsts for eternity. This is the price of their ancestors' excess. This is the inheritance of the fall. Every Eldari child is born already sentenced, already condemned, carrying the weight of sins they did not commit but will suffer for nonetheless. And yet, they persist. The craft world Eldari, those who fled aboard the great vessels before the fall's completion, built their entire civilization around a single desperate strategy, denial, not of guilt or consequence, but of emotion itself. They had seen where passion led. They had witnessed firsthand how desire refined into obsession and obsession into damnation. Their solution was radical, absolute, and utterly unsustainable as a permanent state of being. They created the path. The path system was not governance or philosophy. It was survival methodology, a framework designed to allow Eldari to function while minimizing the psychic resonance that would attract Slaanesh's attention. Every craftworlder was expected to choose a path and follow it with complete dedication until its lessons were learned, its skills mastered, its purpose fulfilled. Only then could they move to another path, beginning the cycle anew. There were paths for every function of Eldari society. The path of the warrior, where controlled violence was channeled through ritual and discipline. The path of the artisan, where creative impulses were expressed within rigid parameters. The path of the seer, where psychic gifts were honed while the wielder remained tethered to emotional restraint through runes and ritual. The path of service, of command, of mourning, each one a carefully constructed framework designed to allow expression while preventing excess. It was a life of perpetual self-denial masquerading as purpose, and for most Eldari it was the only thing standing between them and damnation. The aspect warriors exemplified this philosophy most clearly. When a craftworlder chose the path of the warrior, they did not simply learn to fight. They surrendered themselves to an aspect, a focused expression of war embodied through the worship of Kain's shattered fragments. The dire avengers channeled defensive fury, the howling banshees became living screams of rage, the dark reapers embraced death's inevitability. Each aspect was a mask, a constructed identity that allowed the warrior to kill without losing themselves to bloodlust. When they donned the armor, they became the aspect. When they removed it, they returned to the path. The separation was absolute. It had to be. To blur the line, to carry the warrior's fury into civilian life, was to risk the obsession that fed Slaanesh. Those who could not remove the mask, who found themselves unable to step away from war, became exarchs. These tragic figures remained locked within their aspect forever, their souls merged with the armor itself, their identities subsumed by the role they could no longer abandon. They were honored, they were mourned, they were cautionary tales, but the path alone was not enough to protect Eldari souls from she who thirsts. Physical death remained inevitable, and when death came, The soul's natural trajectory was towards Slaanesh. The god pulled at every Eldari spirit, a constant psychic undertow that intensified the moment flesh failed and the soul became unanchored. The solution was the spirit stone, the waystone, the soul gem that every Eldari wore from childhood until death. These psychically attuned crystals, grown through methods half technology and half ritual, served as anchors. Upon death, an Eldari's soul was drawn not to Slaanesh but into the stone, trapped within crystalline lattices that preserved identity and consciousness while protecting against the god's hunger. It was not life. It was not salvation. It was prevention of something infinitely worse. The stones were then carried back to the craft world and inserted into the infinity circuit, a vast psychic network that ran through every craft world's wraithbone structure. Within the circuit, the dead continued to exist, their consciousness merged with the ship itself, their wisdom accessible to the living, their presence a ghostly community of ancestors who guided and counseled and remembered. To die without a spirit stone, to have one's gem shattered or lost, was the ultimate horror. It meant immediate consumption by Slaanesh, the soul torn apart and digested by a god that had been waiting since before birth. Every Eldari knew someone who had suffered this fate. Every craftworlder had nightmares of their own stone cracking, of dying far from home with none to retrieve their gem, of eternity spent experiencing sensations beyond agony or ecstasy, dissolved into she who thirsts endless appetite. The craftworlds themselves reflected this philosophy of controlled existence. They were cities of rigid beauty, every structure placed with intention, every garden cultivated with purpose. There was no chaos, no spontaneity. Even art was created within parameters, beauty pursued only to specific conclusions before the artist moved to another path. The architecture was elegant and cold, preserving Eldari aesthetic sensibility while draining it of passion. Life aboard the craft worlds was long and hollow. Eldari could live thousands of years, but those years were spent in perpetual restraint. They could not love too deeply, lest love become obsession. They could not grieve too fully, lest sorrow become despair. They could not even feel joy without measuring it, containing it, ensuring it remained within acceptable bounds. They existed as echoes of what their species had been, shadows cast by the burning civilization that had preceded them. And they knew it. Every craftworlder understood that they lived diminished lives, that the glory of the old empire would never return, that they were not building toward anything but merely enduring, generation after generation, in the hope that someday, somehow, a solution might present itself. That hope had a name, whispered in the sanctums of farseers and debated in the councils of autarchs. Yinid, the god of the dead, a prophecy, a possibility, a desperate dream that perhaps, if enough Eldari souls were gathered within the infinity circuits, if enough death was collected and concentrated, a new god might be born, one that could challenge Slaanesh, one that might devour she who thirsts from within and free the Eldari from their eternal damnation. It was a faith built on corpses, a religion of patience that required their entire species to die slowly, correctly, with souls intact, accumulating power across millennia until the moment of critical mass arrived and Unied could awaken. How long would it take? 10,000 years? 100,000? The prophecies were unclear, the futures uncertain, but it was all they had. Hope measured in generations of the dead, salvation that required first the perfection of their own annihilation. Until then, they walked the path. They died with stones in place. They added themselves to the circuit, and they endured. But not all Eldari chose this method of survival. Deep within the webway, isolated from both real space and the warp's direct touch, lay Komara, the Dark City, a realm built on cruelty refined into art form, where the Eldari who would become the Drukhari had discovered a different solution to the problem of Slaanesh. If the craftworld Eldari survived through denial, the Drukhari survived through theft. They had felt the pull during the fall, felt their souls beginning to wither as Slaanesh reached for them. In that moment of existential terror, they made a discovery both practical and damning. The suffering of others, consumed and internalized, could temporarily sate the gods' hunger. Pain, extracted from lesser beings and absorbed by the Eldari inflicting it, could sustain a soul that was slowly being drained. It was not a cure. It was a temporary reprieve, a stay of execution that lasted only as long as the torment continued. They accepted this truth without hesitation. Survival demanded any price, and if that price was paid in the suffering of others, so be it. Comorra became an engine of agony. The city sprawled across impossible dimensions, its architecture as much grown as built, spires of stolen stone and shadowed causeways lit by captured suns kept burning through methods better left unexamined. It was beautiful in its grotesqueness, elegant in its malevolence, a civilization that had embraced damnation so completely that it wore its sin as fashion. The Drukhari raided real space with methodical frequency. Their sleek ships emerged from webway portals without warning, struck with surgical precision, and vanished before retaliation could organize. They took slaves not for labor but for suffering, victims whose pain would sustain their captors' souls. The raids were not random violence but calculated harvest, each one planned to maximize agony extracted per resource expended. In Comorra's arenas, torture became performance art. The Drukhari did not simply kill their victims. They prolonged death, refined suffering, transformed agony into something approaching aesthetic achievement. The Homunculi, flesh sculptors who had mastered the manipulation of biology beyond reason or sanity, could keep a victim alive and aware through mutilations that should have killed instantly. They could stretch a single death across weeks, months, extracting every possible moment of torment before the soul finally escaped and the body was discarded like spent currency. This was not sadism for its own sake, though many Drukhari had long since ceased to distinguish between necessity and pleasure. This was survival. Every scream absorbed was another day their souls remained intact. Every drop of suffering consumed was another moment. Slaanesh's pull weakened. They were addicts feeding an addiction that could never be cured, only temporarily satisfied. The irony was not lost on the more philosophical among them. They had become exactly what their ancestors were, pursuing sensation beyond all reason, obsessed with experience to the exclusion of morality or restraint. The difference was only that they inflicted rather than indulged, took rather than gave. But the fundamental nature remained unchanged. They were still prisoners of excess, still slaves to hunger. They had simply found a way to make others pay the cost. Drukhari society was structured around this necessity. The cabals, piratical organizations that controlled most of the Dark City's power, competed not for territory but for access to suffering. The archons who led these cabals were ancient beyond measure, having sustained themselves through millennia of carefully cultivated cruelty. They were consummate survivors, having outlasted countless rivals through cunning, ruthlessness, and the sheer volume of agony they could accumulate. The witch cults offered entertainment, gladiatorial spectacles where death was performance and the audience fed on the combatants' pain. The Wishes themselves were artists of murder, trained from childhood to kill in ways that maximized suffering while demonstrating inhuman grace. They fought for the roar of the crowd, the adulation of their peers, and the sustenance that came from thousands of Drukhari simultaneously absorbing the death agonies of those who fell in the arena. The Homunculi covens existed outside normal hierarchy, their mastery of fleshcraft making them invaluable and repulsive in equal measure. They could rebuild bodies destroyed beyond recognition, could resurrect the dead provided some genetic material remained, could reshape form into any configuration desired. Their prices were steep and their methods horrifying, but in a city where death was only temporary for those who could afford resurrection, their services were essential. And threading through all of it, unspoken but omnipresent, was the knowledge that every Drukhari was one moment of insufficient cruelty away from damnation. If they failed to feed, if they went too long without inflicting suffering, their souls would begin to wither. They would feel it as a hollowing, a spiritual emptiness that no physical pleasure could fill. And if they ignored it too long, Slaanesh would reach through the gap and claim what had always been promised. Some Drukhari grew tired of the cycle. They sought obliteration, threw themselves into battles they could not win, embraced death as release. Others descended into such depths of depravity that they ceased to recognize their own damnation, becoming more demon than Eldari, their souls so steeped in malevolence that Slaanesh's consumption seemed almost redundant, but most simply continued. They raided, they tortured, they consumed suffering and sustained themselves and told themselves this was survival, not sin. They built their lives around the harvest of agony and called it culture. There were no spirit stones in Comorra, no infinity circuit, no hope of Yinid. Only the eternal now, the perpetual hunt, the endless feeding. The Drukhari had traded their future for their present, abandoned any possibility of salvation for the certainty of prolonged existence. They would never be free, but they would endure, and in their own twisted way, they had found a dark contentment in that truth. Far from both Craftworld and Dark City, on worlds scattered across the galaxy's rim, the Exodites maintained their own form of resistance. These Eldari had fled the Empire generations before the fall, foreseeing catastrophe and choosing simplicity over sophistication. They had bonded with the world spirits, vast planetary consciousnesses that predated Eldari civilization, ancient entities of psychic power rooted in the very geology and biosphere of virgin worlds. The Exodites' solution to Slaanesh was communion. They anchored their souls not to stones but to the world spirits themselves, merging their psychic essence with something older and more fundamental than any individual consciousness. When an Exodite died, their soul flowed not to Slaanesh but into the world spirit, becoming part of the planetary consciousness. Their identity preserved within something too vast for she who thirsts to easily devour. It was effective, it was also limiting. An Exodite could never leave their world, not for long. To venture beyond the world spirit's reach was to expose themselves to Slaanesh's pull without protection. They were prisoners of their own salvation, bound to their planets as surely as the Drukhari were bound to Comorrag's shadows or the Craftworlders to their paths. Exodite life was deliberately primitive. They rejected the technology that had enabled their ancestors' excess, choosing instead to live in harmony with their world's natural cycles. They rode great reptilian beasts, cultivated simple agriculture, and organized their societies around tribal structures that emphasized community over individuality. It was a harsh existence, dangerous and short by Eldari standards, but it was clean, untainted, free from the obsession that had doomed their species. When the fall occurred, the Exodites felt it through their world spirits. The planetary consciousnesses screamed, overwhelmed by the psychic shockwave of a god being born. Many Exodites died in that moment, their souls torn free despite their bonds. Those who survived found their connection to the world spirits stronger, more necessary. The entities had absorbed the shock, had shielded their bonded Eldari through sacrifice of their own essence. The debt was understood. The Exodites would remain, they would nurture their worlds. They would never abandon their guardian spirits, not when those spirits had proven their devotion through such cost. They were the smallest surviving Eldari faction, scattered and isolated, lacking the numbers or resources to influence galactic events. But they were perhaps the most psychologically stable, having never known the heights of civilization from which the others had fallen. They mourned their lost kin. They hated Slaanesh with a pure, simple fury. But they were not haunted by what they had been, because they had chosen to be something else long before the fall. They tended their worlds. They raised their children in traditions older than the Empire. They lived and died and joined the world spirits, adding their wisdom to the eternal chorus. And they endured, quiet and forgotten, a fragment of what the Eldari might have been had they chosen humility over hubris. But there were others who had survived through methods stranger still. The Harlequins, servants of Segorach the Laughing God, existed outside all other Eldari factions. They traveled the webway at will, appearing on craft worlds and Exodite worlds alike, performing their dances and plays, keeping alive the stories of the fall. They wore masks that hid their identities completely, surrendering self to role, becoming the characters they portrayed so thoroughly that even they could not always remember who they had been beneath the disguise. Segorach had protected them. The Laughing God had danced away from Slaanesh's birth. escaping consumption through trickery and speed. His followers remained hidden within his shadow, their souls somehow shielded by their god's continued existence and their own commitment to his service. They could die without spirit stones and still escape she who thirsts. Their souls claimed by Segurach instead, drawn into the god's domain within the deepest webway to serve eternally in the war against chaos. The Harlequins spoke in riddles and moved through prophecy. Their performances were not mere entertainment but living history, morality tales, warnings and promises woven together. They laughed at things that should inspire horror. They mourned in silence what others celebrated. They were mad and wise in equal measure, having stared at the truth of the fall and chosen mockery over despair. They claimed Segurach had a plan, that the laughing god was weaving a great jest that would span millennia and end with Slaanesh's destruction. They never explained what this plan entailed. Perhaps they did not know. Perhaps the plan existed only in potential. 1,000 possible futures that would collapse into one at the moment of perfect timing. Or perhaps there was no plan at all, only the eternal defiance of laughter in the face of damnation. The Harlequins did not care if others believed them. They danced, they performed, they kept the stories alive, and they waited, patient and manic, for the punchline only they could perceive. These, then, were the survivors, the craftworlders with their paths and spirit stones, living diminished lives in the hope of eventual salvation, the Drukhari with their cruelty and raids, feeding on suffering to forestall the inevitable, the Exodites with their world spirits, choosing isolation over freedom, the Harlequins with their masks and mysteries, trusting in a god who laughed while the galaxy burned. None of them were free. None of them were saved. They had merely found different methods of postponement, different strategies for enduring what could not be escaped. Every Aeldari, regardless of faction or philosophy, lived under Slaanesh's shadow. The god was patient. The god was inevitable. Death would come eventually, and when it did, only the most careful preparations would prevent an eternity of consumption. They told themselves they were surviving. Perhaps they were, but survival was not living. It was simply the absence of death. And for the Aeldari, even that absence was temporary, conditional, dependent on maintaining practices and disciplines that required constant vigilance. They had once been the galaxy's masters. Now they were its most tragic survivors, a species defined entirely by what they had lost and what still hunted them. They built no new empires, they pursued no grand ambitions, they simply endured, generation after generation, hoping that endurance itself might somehow lead to salvation. In the Craftworld Council chambers, autarchs debated strategy that centered on conservation rather than expansion, how to preserve their dwindling numbers, how to protect their infinity circuits, how to balance the need for warriors against the danger of losing too many souls to battle. Every decision was calculated not for victory but for survival, for stretching their existence across millennia in the hope that time itself might offer a solution they could not perceive. In Komorog's palatial spires, archons schemed for advantage, measured in access to slaves and influence over rivals. They did not dream of freedom or redemption. They dreamed of maintaining their position, of ensuring their own sustenance, of outlasting their competitors in a game that could never truly be won. Power in the Dark City meant nothing beyond prolonged existence. There were no great causes, no higher purposes, only the immediate need and the methods required to satisfy it. On the Exodite worlds, tribal elders taught the young the old ways, ensuring knowledge survived even as those who held it passed into the world's spirits. They told stories of the fall, warning each generation against the pride and excess that had doomed their species. They cultivated humility as a virtue and restraint as a survival mechanism. They lived simply and died young by Aeldari standards, their lives brief candles burning clean rather than the long, guttering flames of their Craftworld cousins. And throughout it all, threading between the factions, the Harlequins danced. They performed the fall again and again, forcing Aeldari to remember, to witness, to understand the price of excess. They mocked the mighty and mourned the fallen. They laughed at doom and wept at jokes. They were the conscience their species no longer possessed, the memory it wished to forget, the hope it could barely imagine. The Eldari endured, but endurance without purpose is merely waiting, and they waited, all of them, in their different ways, for something that might never come. For Yinid to awaken, for Segarak's plan to unfold, for some unexpected salvation to emerge from a galaxy that had proven remarkably short on salvation. Until then, they walked their paths. They inflicted their cruelties, they tended their worlds, they danced their dances, and every night, in the quiet moments before sleep, every Eldari touched the spirit stone at their throat and wondered if this would be the day it failed. If this would be the moment Slaanesh's hunger finally overwhelmed whatever protection they had managed to construct. They were the souls that remained, the survivors of catastrophe, the inheritors of the fall, and they carried that inheritance like chains, dragging it behind them through history, hoping that someday, somehow, the weight might lift. But Slaanesh was patient, and she who thirsts had already waited for millions of years. What was a few millennia more to a god who had infinity to feast? The hunger was constant, the prey was marked, and the Eldari, all of them, were merely postponing the inevitable consumption that awaited beyond the veil of death. They lived in shadow. They died with prayers on their lips, and their souls, carefully preserved or cruelly sustained, remained tantalizingly out of reach of a god that owned them regardless. The souls that remained were not free, they were merely uncollected, and the difference, in the end, was far smaller than they wished to believe. There are warriors who fight for duty, their valor measured in discipline and sacrifice. There are warriors who fight for survival, their courage born of necessity and desperation. And then there are the Space Marines, the Adeptus Astartes, humanity's most perfect soldiers, engineered from gene seed and indoctrination to be living weapons beyond mortal limitation. They were created to be incorruptible, to stand as bulwarks against every horror the galaxy could manifest. Slaanesh proved them wrong. The corruption of the Space Marines by the Dark Prince is a tragedy told in stages, a descent that begins with aspiration and ends in damnation so complete that the victims celebrate their own destruction. It is a story that has repeated across 10,000 years, claiming chapters and warbands, corrupting gene lines and twisting brotherhoods into reflections of excess that would have been unthinkable to those who first took the Astartes oaths. The story begins before the Imperium knew Slaanesh's name, in the golden age that was already tarnished, during the Great Crusade, when the Emperor's vision of human unity was still possible, and the Primarchs were sons rather than myths or monsters. Fulgrim was beautiful, not simply in appearance, though the Primarch of the Emperor's children was indeed striking, possessed of features that seemed sculpted rather than born. His beauty was deeper, more fundamental. It resided in his movements, each gesture precise and economical. In his words, each sentence crafted for maximum impact. In his philosophy, which held that humanity's salvation lay not merely in conquest, but in the perfection of all endeavors. He believed that excellence was not a destination but a journey, that every action could be refined, every skill elevated, every achievement transcended. His legion reflected this philosophy. The Emperor's children were not the most numerous legion, nor the most brutal, but they were arguably the most disciplined, the most dedicated to their craft. They sought perfection in all things. Their bolter drills achieved accuracies other legions dismissed as impossible. Their blade work was studied as much as practiced, each movement analyzed and refined until technique became art. Their armor was maintained to standards that bordered on obsessive, every detail attended to, every imperfection corrected. They were the Emperor's finest, and they knew it. This knowledge was not boastfulness, but simple recognition of fact. They had earned their excellence through dedication and discipline. They wore their superiority like their armor, not as pride but as identity. The flaw was subtle, invisible, so deeply woven into the Legion's culture that none recognized it as weakness. They had confused perfection with purpose. They had made excellence itself the goal, rather than excellence in service of a higher calling. And when perfection becomes the object of worship, when the pursuit of excellence consumes all other considerations, A door opens that cannot easily be closed. Slaanesh had been watching. The god was always watching. The corruption began on a world called Laeran. The Emperor's children had been tasked with bringing this system into compliance, a routine operation against a Xenos species that had achieved technological sophistication approaching humanity's own. The Laer were serpentine creatures who had mastered biological and mechanical integration, their civilization built around the refinement of sensation and experience. They fought with weapons that stimulated neural pathways that killed through pleasure and pain, indistinguishable from one another. Their temples were architectures of desire. Their culture was excess given form. They were, in essence, a species that had already fallen to Slaanesh, though the Emperor's children did not yet understand what that meant. The campaign should have been straightforward. The Emperor's children outnumbered and outclassed the Laer in every measurable category. But the fighting stretched on, day after day, week after week. The Laer fought with unexpected ferocity, their weapons proving disturbingly effective against Astartes' physiology. And more troubling, the Emperor's children began to change. It started with appreciation. The Laer artifacts recovered from temples and battlefields were examined with professional interest. The weapons were elegant, their design philosophy sophisticated. The temples were beautiful in their alien way, their architecture incorporating principles that human aesthetics had never considered. Some of the Marines began keeping trophies, small pieces of Laer craft that demonstrated particular excellence. It was not greed. It was appreciation for quality, for mastery, for the refinement the Laer had achieved. Fulgrim himself claimed a sword from a Laer temple. The blade was exquisite, its edge maintaining sharpness through methods Imperial tech priests could not decipher. Its balance perfect, its design incorporating aesthetic principles that made it as much artwork as weapon. He began carrying it in place of his own weapons, drawn by its excellence, unable to resist the perfection of its craft. The sword was possessed, not by a daemon of Slaanesh specifically, but by a fragment of the god's will, a splinter of desire given semi-independent existence and bound within Laer-forged steel. It whispered to Fulgrim in frequencies below conscious hearing. It showed him visions in the space between thoughts. It promised him that perfection was achievable, that excellence could be transcended, that he had only scratched the surface of what was possible. And Fulgrim listened, not because he was weak, not because his will failed, but because the sword told him exactly what he already believed, reflected his own philosophy back at him in purified form, offered him the logical conclusion of principles he had always held. He began to change. Subtly at first, his pursuit of perfection intensified. Where once he had been satisfied with mastery, now he sought transcendence. Where once he had refined technique, now he pursued sensation. The difference seemed academic, a matter of degree rather than kind. His officers noticed nothing amiss except that their Primarch seemed more focused, more dedicated, more himself than ever before. They did not see the corruption flowering. They could not. The trap Slaanesh laid was perfect in its simplicity. The Emperor's children were already predisposed toward excellence. All the sword did was amplify that predisposition, push it past the boundaries of reason into the realm of obsession. And obsession, once established, fed itself. By the time the Laer campaign concluded, the damage was done. The Emperor's children had defeated the Xenos, but victory tasted hollow. They had seen something in Laer culture that resonated, an approach to existence that elevated experience above mere function. They had touched artifacts that promised transcendence. And they had a Primarch who increasingly defined success not by compliance brought or battles won, but by the perfection of the act itself. The corruption accelerated during the Horus heresy, when the War Master turned against the Emperor and half the legions descended into civil war. The Emperor's children followed not out of loyalty to Horus, but because Fulgrim convinced them that the Imperium's rigid orthodoxy was antithetical to perfection. The Emperor, their Primarch argued, had created them to be warriors, but they had transcended that purpose. They had become artists, and artists could not be bound by the limitations of lesser minds. The logic was seductive. The Emperor's children had always believed themselves superior, Now they were being told that their superiority demanded freedom, that true excellence could not flourish within the confines of imperial doctrine. They were being offered license to pursue their refinement without restraint, to explore every possibility, to achieve heights that loyalty would have forever denied them. They embraced treachery as liberation. They called it enlightenment. The massacre at Istvan III eliminated those within the Legion who refused to follow Fulgrim into damnation. Loyalist Emperor's children were betrayed and slaughtered by their own brothers, virus bombed and burned, their objections silenced before the corruption could spread. What remained was a Legion unified in its pursuit of excess, a brotherhood of Astartes who had crossed the line from discipline into decadence and found the transition easier than they had imagined. They began experimenting, not with tactics or weapons, but with sensation itself. The apothecaries, those Marines charged with maintaining their brother's physical perfection, started modifying their own neurochemistry. They enhanced pain receptors, theorizing that greater sensitivity would lead to greater awareness. They stimulated pleasure centers, seeking to understand the full spectrum of experience. They modified their bodies in ways the Emperor's genecraft had never intended, adding sensation receptors, altering perception, chasing experiences that transhuman physiology normally prohibited. It felt like research, like the pursuit of knowledge, like the refinement of the human form toward its ultimate potential. They told themselves they were still serving the Emperor's vision, still seeking to perfect humanity. They simply recognized that perfection required exploring territories the Emperor's limited understanding had forbidden. They were already damned. They simply had not yet realized it. The full descent occurred during the drop site massacre at Istvan V. The Loyalist legions, come to bring the traitors to justice, were betrayed by forces they had believed were allies. The Emperor's children participated in the slaughter, but their method of war had changed. They no longer sought efficient kills or tactical advantage. They sought the perfect death, the ideal moment of combat, the transcendent experience of violence refined into art. They painted their armor in garish colors, violating the proud purple and gold they had once worn with such discipline. They adorned themselves with excess, with trophies taken not for honor but for aesthetic impact. They began using weapons that prioritized sensation over lethality, sonic devices that could shatter ceramite and liquefy organs while forcing victims to experience every microsecond of their destruction. The Noise Marines were born in those killing fields. Astartes who had so thoroughly modified themselves in pursuit of sensation that normal human experience had become insufficient. They required stimulation beyond mortal capacity, needed input so overwhelming that unaugmented nervous systems would have burned out under the load. Sound became their medium. They wielded sonic weapons that could peel flesh from bone, could induce hemorrhaging through resonance, could kill through frequencies that existed at the edge of perception, and they experienced every death they inflicted as ecstasy, their modified nervous systems translating destruction into pleasure so intense it became its own form of addiction. They no longer fought for the War Master. They no longer fought for anything except the act of fighting itself, for the sensations combat provided, for the perfection of violence as artistic expression. They had become exactly what Slaanesh desired. Warriors who had transcended purpose, who had refined their martial excellence into pure experience, who killed not from duty but from the exquisite pleasure killing provided. Fulgrim's transformation completed during this period. The Primarch, already deeply corrupted by the Leia blade, achieved apotheosis. He ascended to daemonhood, his physical form reshaped into something that was still beautiful but beauty married to horror. He became a daemon prince of Slaanesh, his soul claimed and elevated, his existence now tied directly to the god he had unknowingly served since claiming that cursed sword. His legion followed. Not all achieved daemonhood, but all were marked. The Emperor's children ceased to be a legion in any meaningful military sense. They became a collection of warbands, each pursuing its own definition of perfection, united only by their service to Slaanesh and their shared obsession with sensation beyond reason. They raided not for conquest, but for experience. They descended on worlds and took what pleased them, subjecting populations to torments that combined artistry and atrocity. They stole artifacts, took slaves, harvested sensations like others might harvest resources. They transformed entire cities into galleries, showcasing their understanding of suffering as art form, then abandoned them when novelty faded and boredom demanded new canvases. The Imperium named them traitors, heretics, lost. They called themselves enlightened, transcendent, perfected. The gulf between self-perception and reality was so vast that communication became impossible. The Emperor's children could not be reasoned with because they no longer shared a common frame of reference with the species they had been created to protect. They had become alien, other, creatures wearing the shapes of men but motivated by hungers that humanity could not comprehend. But the Emperor's children were not alone in their fall. Slaanesh's corruption of the Astartes proved to be not an isolated incident, but a repeating pattern. The Dark Prince demonstrated a particular talent for claiming space marines, for finding the cracks in their indoctrination and exploiting psychological vulnerabilities their creators had not anticipated. Throughout the millennia following the heresy, chapters fell, not always dramatically, not always all at once, but regularly enough that the Imperium learned to watch for the signs, to recognize the early stages of Slaaneshi corruption before it metastasized into full damnation. A chapter of blood, Angel's successors became obsessed with achieving the perfect death in combat. They began taking unnecessary risks, seeking not victory but the most aesthetically satisfying method of achieving it. They criticized each other's kills, refined their techniques, transformed war into performance. By the time the Inquisition became aware, the entire chapter had crossed the line from martial excellence into decadent obsession. They died fighting each other, each one trying to achieve the perfect kill against a worthy opponent before Slaanesh claimed them. A White Scar's successor chapter, founded on principles of speed and mobility, began competing to achieve faster and faster attacks. They modified their bikes beyond safety limits, stimulated their reflexes until reaction time approached precognition, pushed themselves to velocities that should have been unsurvivable. They chased the sensation of speed itself, the rush of velocity as its own reward. They became addicted to momentum, to the feeling of reality blurring at the edges of perception. When they finally entered the warp, their ships accelerating towards speeds that made no sense in real space, they were never seen again. The last transmission was laughter and the sound of engines screaming. An Ultramarine's successor, dedicated to tactical perfection and strategic excellence, descended into paralysis by analysis. They began spending weeks planning engagements that should have taken days, months on operations that required weeks. Every variable had to be accounted for, every contingency planned, every scenario modeled to absolute certainty. Perfection of planning became more important than execution. They eventually stopped fighting altogether, their entire chapter consumed by the pursuit of the theoretically perfect battle plan that existed only as abstraction. When Imperial forces arrived to investigate their silence, they found a fortress monastery filled with strategic charts, tactical projections, and Astartes who had starved to death while calculating the ideal angles of approach. The methods varied, but the pattern remained consistent. Slaanesh corrupted space marines not by making them weak, but by amplifying their strengths beyond sustainability. The god took what made them excellent and pushed it past the boundaries of reason into obsession, into addiction, into damnation that wore excellence's face. The Noise Marines became Slaanesh's most iconic Astartes servants, but they were far from the only expression of the Dark Prince's influence among the Space Marines. There were apothecaries who became so obsessed with perfecting the human form that they transformed themselves and their victims into living sculptures of flesh, biological impossibilities that somehow continued to function. There were chaplains who had once preached the imperial creed, now sermonizing about the divinity of sensation, converting entire populations to Slaanesh's worship through words alone. There were librarians whose psychic gifts, turned toward the exploration of forbidden sensation, became conduits for demonic incursion. Each fell in their own way. Each found their own path into damnation. But all paths led to the same destination, to Slaanesh, to the eternal hunger, to existence defined entirely by the pursuit of experience beyond reason or restraint. The tragedy was that many of them never understood they had fallen. They died believing themselves enlightened, transcendent, perfected. They saw their corruption as evolution, their damnation as ascension. The Emperor's children genuinely believed they had achieved what the Emperor had intended for them, that they had fulfilled their purpose and transcended it. The fact that they had betrayed everything they were created to protect, had become the very thing they were meant to destroy, simply did not register. The obsession had consumed even their capacity for self-reflection. The Imperium learned to watch for the signs. Unusual interest in artistry, excessive concern with appearance or aesthetic, modifications to armor or equipment that prioritized beauty over function, Marines who spoke of perfection as a goal rather than a standard, chapters that began measuring success by criteria other than compliance brought and enemies destroyed. None of these were definitive proof of corruption, but all were warning signs that required investigation. The problem was that the line between excellence and excess was not always clear. Space Marines were supposed to pursue perfection in their craft. They were supposed to refine their skills, maintain their equipment to the highest standards, strive for the ideal execution of their duty. These were not signs of corruption but expectations of the Astartes Code. Distinguishing between proper dedication and the early stages of Slaaneshi influence required subtlety that many imperial authorities lacked. How many chapters were declared excommunicate traitorous for crimes they had not yet committed? How many were destroyed for pursuing excellence that had not quite crossed into obsession? The Imperium could not afford mercy or uncertainty. Suspicion was sufficient. The cost of a corrupted chapter loose in the galaxy outweighed the loss of potentially loyal Astartes. Better to destroy 100 chapters that might have been saved than to let one corrupted legion survive. This calculus was logical. It was also tragic, and it fed Slaanesh regardless. The Marines who were destroyed unjustly died in bitterness and betrayal, their faith shattered. Those emotions, that sense of persecution and abandonment, made them vulnerable in their final moments. Some cursed the Emperor who had abandoned them. Some swore vengeance against an Imperium that had turned on its protectors, and in those moments of rage and despair, Slaanesh was there, whispering, offering power, promising that they could have their revenge, that they could prove the Imperium wrong by showing what they were truly capable of achieving. Some accepted, and in accepting, validated the Imperium's suspicions retroactively. They became the traitors they had been accused of being, not because they were corrupted initially, but because corruption was offered as the only path forward when loyalty had been rewarded with extermination. It was a cycle that fed itself. Suspicion bred destruction, destruction bred bitterness, bitterness bred corruption. Corruption validated suspicion, and Slaanesh, patient and eternal, collected souls regardless of which stage of the cycle they fell at. The modern Imperium faced warbands of Slaaneshi Marines across countless sectors. The Emperor's children remained the largest and most infamous, their scattered warbands pursuing their own obsessions while nominally united in service to their absent Primarch. But they were joined by fragments of other legions, chapters that had fallen during or after the heresy, renegades who had found purpose in sensation after losing faith in the Emperor's distant light. These warbands raided Imperial space with disturbing frequency. They struck without warning, their goals incomprehensible to Imperial strategists. They might massacre an entire hive city and leave without taking slaves or supplies. They might carefully torture a planetary governor while leaving the rest of the world untouched. They might spend months on a world doing nothing but painting a cathedral in colors that induced madness in anyone who viewed them. Their actions defied military logic because they were not soldiers anymore. They were artists using the galaxy as canvas, slaves to sensation using real space as the medium for expressing desires that could not be satisfied. They fought not to win, but to experience. Killed not to achieve objectives, but because the act of killing had become its own purpose. Defending against them was nearly impossible. How do you fortify against an enemy that does not want your territory or resources? How do you predict the movements of warriors who make decisions based on aesthetic whim rather than strategic necessity? The Imperium tried. Battle fleets were deployed. Chapters were tasked with hunting specific warbands. The Inquisition maintained networks of informants watching for signs of Slaaneshi activity. None of it was enough. Slaanesh's servants were not trying to conquer the Imperium. They were merely playing in its ruins, sampling its populations, experiencing what it had to offer before moving on. They could not be defeated because they had no objectives to deny them. They could not be deterred because they did not fear death. Many actively sought it, viewing death in perfect combat as the ultimate sensation, the final experience that would complete their existence. The corruption continued. New warbands formed. New chapters fell. The pattern repeated across centuries, across millennia, each iteration slightly different but fundamentally the same. Space Marines, created to be incorruptible, proving to be anything but. Astartes, engineered for perfection, discovering that perfection itself could be the path to damnation. And Slaanesh smiled, patient and eternal, knowing that humanity's finest warriors were also its most vulnerable to the temptations the Dark Prince offered. Because Space Marines were not made to be human, they were made to transcend humanity, to achieve beyond mortal limitation. And that drive to transcend, that refusal to accept limits, that dedication to achieving the impossible was exactly the mindset Slaanesh required. The Emperor had created gods of war. Slaanesh simply taught them that war could be worship, that violence could be art, that killing could be ecstasy. And once that lesson was learned, once the boundary between duty and desire dissolved, there was no path back. Only forward, deeper into excess, further into damnation, until the warrior became the weapon, and the weapon became the offering, and the offering was consumed by a god that had been waiting since before they took their first breath. The corruption of angels was complete not when they fell, but when they ceased to recognize they had fallen at all. When damnation became indistinguishable from enlightenment, when slavery to sensation was mistaken for transcendence, when the Dark Prince's laughter echoed through their minds and they heard only the sound of their own perfection being acknowledged, they were lost. They had always been lost. They simply had not realized it until the moment of their final transformation, when flesh gave way to daemon stuff and the last vestige of what they had been burned away in the ecstasy of apotheosis. And even then, they did not mourn, they celebrated. They had achieved what they always sought. They had transcended mortality. They had become perfect, and Slaanesh, feeding on their souls for eternity, agreed. There are endings that conclude, that bring resolution and finality. There are endings that transform, that mark transition from one state to another. And then there are the endings that are not endings at all, merely pauses in cycles that have no completion, only continuation. The story of Slaanesh has no ending, cannot have an ending, because hunger, by its nature, is infinite. 10,000 years have passed since the fall. 10 millennia of souls consumed, civilizations corrupted, and excess refined into art form. Slaanesh has grown, has consolidated power, has established dominion over realms both material and immaterial. The god is stronger now than at birth, fed by millennia of mortal indulgence, sustained by the endless stream of those who mistake obsession for passion and call their damnation enlightenment. And yet, for the first time since the moment of terrible birth, she who thirsts knows something approaching fear. The Inari emerged not as prophecy fulfilled but as desperation made manifest. For millennia, the Aeldari had whispered of Yniad, the god of the dead, a theoretical deity that might arise from the accumulated souls within the infinity circuits. The prophecy had always been passive, a promise that someday, after enough death, after sufficient souls had been gathered and preserved, Yniad would spontaneously awaken and challenge Slaanesh for dominion over the Aeldari species. The Inari rejected patience. They chose action. They began as heretics, Aeldari from across all factions who shared a singular, radical belief. Yniad did not need to wait for natural accumulation. The god could be awakened early, forced into existence through sacrifice and ritual, through the intentional destruction of infinity circuits and the mass offering of Aeldari souls. It was a theology built on genocide, a faith that demanded the death of billions of their own kind, to birth something that might, possibly, save the species entire. Most Eldari recoiled in horror. The infinity circuits were sacred, the preserved souls of ancestors and loved ones. To shatter them deliberately, to destroy those carefully preserved essences in the hope of creating something new, was obscenity beyond measure. It was the very excess that had damned them originally, the same arrogance that had birthed Slaanesh, repeated as farce. But others listened. Others, who had grown weary of 10,000 years of mere survival, who had watched their species dwindle and their options narrow, who understood that waiting for salvation meant waiting forever. They were desperate. They were willing to gamble everything on the possibility that action, even terrible action, might succeed where patience had only produced slow extinction. The Inari's prophet was Ivrain, an Aeldari who had died and returned, touched by Ynied's nascent consciousness in the moment between death and damnation. She spoke with the authority of one who had glimpsed what lay beyond and returned to tell of it. She claimed Ynied was real, was wakening, needed only the proper catalyst to fully manifest. She gathered followers from every faction, craftworlders who had grown tired of the path, Drukhari who sought escape from their endless feeding, Exodites who saw no future in isolation. Harlequins who claimed Segarach smiled upon this gambit. They called themselves the Reborn. They walked a road paved with the souls of their own kind, and they shattered the first infinity circuit deliberately, releasing the souls within not to Slaanesh but to Ynied, feeding the nascent god with the essence of the dead, gambling that accumulated death would achieve what accumulated waiting had not. Slaanesh felt it. Felt souls that should have been claimed slipping away, felt a presence forming in the warp that was not chaos but something older, colder, more fundamental. The god of the dead was stirring, and for the first time since birth, she who thirsts understood that the Eldari might genuinely escape. The Dark Prince's reaction was rage refined into obsession. Slaanesh had considered the Eldari as property, as livestock, as a species that existed solely to eventually feed the god that had birthed itself from their excess. The idea that they might deny this destiny, that they might create something capable of challenging Slaanesh's claim, was intolerable, unacceptable, an offense that demanded response. But response required caution. Ynied was not yet fully manifest, existed only as potential, as nascent divinity gathering power but not yet coherent enough to act independently. If Slaanesh attacked directly, through its full force against the Inari, the Dark Prince risked accelerating Ynied's birth, providing the very crisis that might catalyze the god of the dead into full awakening. So Slaanesh waited, watched, sent demons to harass but not destroy, corrupted where possible, isolated where not. The god played a careful game, trying to undermine the Inari without providing them the martyrdom that might transform their cause from heresy into crusade. It was not enough. Ynied continued to grow, not rapidly, not dramatically, but consistently, inevitably, fed by every Inari who died in faith rather than fear, every soul deliberately given to the god of the dead rather than hoarded in infinity circuits. The Aeldari had found a third path between craftworld restraint and Drukhari cruelty. It was a path of sacrifice, of conscious choice to become fuel for something greater. And it was working. The Incarn manifested as Ynied's avatar, a being of death made manifest, capable of walking between real space and warp, neither fully demon nor entirely mortal. It appeared on battlefields where Eldari fought and died, gathering their souls, protecting them from Slaanesh's grasp, channeling them toward Ynied's growing consciousness. It was not yet a god, but it was God-touched, divine potential given temporary form and terrible purpose. Slaanesh could not claim it, could not corrupt it, could not destroy it. The Incarni was everything the Dark Prince was not. Cold where Slaanesh was passionate, purposeful where the Dark Prince was indulgent, defined by what it denied rather than what it desired. It was anathema, opposition given form, the first genuine threat Slaanesh had faced since achieving divinity. The war between Slaanesh and Ynied was not fought with armies or fleets. It was fought soul by soul, each Aeldari death a contested prize, each moment of transition between life and afterlife a battlefield where two gods grappled for supremacy. Most souls still went to Slaanesh. The Dark Prince's claim remained strong, backed by millennia of accumulated power and the simple fact that most Eldari still died in fear rather than faith. But some escaped. A trickle at first, then a stream, then a growing river of souls diverted from she who thirsts toward the god of the dead. Slaanesh weakened. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but measurably, noticeably. For the first time since birth, the god's domain in the warp remained vast. The palaces of excess still stretched across impossible dimensions. The demonic hosts still numbered beyond counting. But there was a hollowness now, a hunger slightly less sated, a void that no amount of mortal suffering seemed to completely fill. The Dark Prince had gorged for 10,000 years on Eldari souls. Now, suddenly, the feast was being interrupted. Plates were being removed before the god could finish, and Slaanesh, for whom satisfaction was alien and fullness impossible, felt something almost like lack. It was infuriating. It was intolerable. It was, in its own way, exquisite. But the Ynnari were only one threat among many that the era Indomitus had brought. The galaxy itself had changed, transformed by events that even the Chaos Gods had not fully anticipated. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, had torn across reality, a wound in space-time that made the Eye of Terror seem almost contained by comparison. It was a scar across the galaxy, a massive warp storm that divided the Imperium in half and made the barrier between material and immaterial almost non-existent across vast regions of space. For Slaanesh, the rift was opportunity and complication intertwined. The weakened barrier meant easier access to real space, meant demons could manifest with less difficulty, meant corruption could spread more rapidly across worlds where reality itself had grown thin, but it also meant competition. The other Chaos Gods gained the same advantages, and the rift's opening had been Tzeentch's scheme, not Slaanesh's, which meant the Architect of Fate had gained political advantage in the great game that the Dark Prince had not anticipated. Slaanesh's influence spread nonetheless. In the regions touched by the rift, where warp and reality blurred, entire civilizations found themselves experiencing phenomena they could not explain. Populations reported mass hallucinations, collective obsessions, cities where everyone suddenly pursued the same inexplicable goal with single-minded intensity. These were not invasions or possessions in the traditional sense. They were infections of concept, of idea, of desire made contagious through the thinned barriers between thought and reality. An imperial hive world experienced an epidemic of artistic obsession. Within weeks, every citizen had abandoned their duties to pursue creative endeavors. They painted, sculpted, composed, wrote, danced, performed. Productivity ceased. Infrastructure collapsed. But the population did not care. They had discovered something more important than survival, more essential than food or water or shelter. They had discovered art. By the time imperial forces arrived to restore order, the entire hive had transformed into a gallery of madness, millions of works created by hands that had forgotten why they created, minds that had long since dissolved into pure creative impulse. The Imperium burned the world. There was no other option. The infection could not be quarantined, could not be cured. It was not a disease of the body but of the spirit, a corruption that made its victims smile even as they starved to death clutching their masterpieces. A forge world of the Adeptus Mechanicus fell to a different expression of Slaanesh's nature. The tech priests, already prone to obsessive pursuit of knowledge, became fixated on achieving the perfect machine. Not a functional machine, not an efficient machine. The perfect machine, an ideal that existed only in theory. They stripped down their manufactorums, dismantled weapons and vehicles, reconfigured entire production lines in pursuit of this theoretical perfection. The Fabricator General claimed they were on the verge of understanding the machine god's true nature, that perfection was within reach, that one more calculation, one more refinement, one more adjustment would reveal the divine truth hidden within the mathematics of creation. They were still calculating when the world's reactor systems failed from lack of maintenance. The perfect machine was never built, perhaps it never could be, but they died believing they were close, believing that perfection had been within reach, believing that their pursuit was holy rather than heretical. These were not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a larger pattern. Slaanesh's influence in the era Indomitus was more subtle than Khorne's direct violence, or Nurgle's obvious plague, but no less pervasive. The Dark Prince corrupted not through invasion but through inspiration, not through possession but through obsession, not through force but through the victim's own desires turned against them. The Imperium struggled to respond. How do you fight an enemy that uses your own passions as weapons? How do you defend against corruption that presents itself as enlightenment, as excellence, as the fulfillment of your deepest aspirations? The Inquisition tried. Ordo Hereticus agents learned to recognize the signs, to identify the early stages of Slaaneshi corruption before it metastasized. But recognition and prevention were different things. By the time corruption was identified, it had usually progressed too far to reverse. The only solution was extermination. Burn the infected, purge the compromised, salt the earth, and pray the taint had not spread. It was brutal. It was necessary. And it was insufficient. For every cult discovered and destroyed, 3 more formed in shadows, their members not even aware they were worshipping, not even recognizing that their pursuit of excellence had crossed the line into excess. The cults took infinite forms. On feudal worlds, they appeared as mystery schools teaching esoteric martial arts that prioritized beauty over effectiveness, that valued the perfect form over the successful kill. On civilized worlds, they manifested as artistic movements that celebrated transgression, that insisted suffering was merely unexplored sensation, that pushed boundaries until boundaries ceased to exist. On hive worlds, they were gangs that organized around sensation-seeking, that raided not for resources but for experiences, that killed not from necessity but from the aesthetic appeal of violence refined into performance. Each cult was different. Each expressed Slaanesh's nature through local culture, through the particular vulnerabilities and obsessions of their founding population. But all led to the same destination, to damnation, to consumption, to souls fed to a god that had been waiting since before the cult formed, that had planted the seeds of corruption generations earlier and now simply waited for harvest. And the harvest was abundant. Humanity numbered in the trillions across millions of worlds. Even if only a fraction of a percent fell to Slaanesh, that fraction represented billions of souls, billions of offerings, billions of moments of sensation and excess and obsession channeled through the warp to feed the Dark Prince's eternal hunger. It was not enough. It would never be enough. Slaanesh's hunger was not a deficit to be filled, but a fundamental characteristic, an endless void that consumed without ever being satisfied. The god did not eat to sustain itself. It ate because eating was its nature, because hunger was its identity, because satiation would mean annihilation of self. The other chaos gods continued their eternal rivalry. Khorne's daemons clashed with Slaanesh's wherever they met. The blood god's straightforward brutality opposed to the Dark Prince's seductive complexity. Their mortal followers fought proxy wars across countless worlds, each side convinced of its superiority, neither recognizing that they served the same fundamental purpose. Both harvested souls, both fed the warp's endless appetite. The methods differed, but the destination remained identical. Nurgle regarded Slaanesh with the patience of entropy. The Plague Father understood that all sensation eventually dulls, all pleasure grows stale, all excess consumes itself. He waited, knowing that Slaanesh's own nature would eventually produce a harvest of despairing souls who had exhausted every possible experience and found them all hollow. When they came to him, when they finally accepted that release from desire was the only true freedom, he would welcome them. He always did. Time was infinite. Nurgle had eternity to wait. Tseentch wove Slaanesh into schemes within schemes, using the Dark Prince's nature as a tool without the god's awareness or consent. A carefully placed temptation here would cause a chain reaction there, leading to outcomes that served Tseentch's incomprehensible goals. The Architect of Fate found Slaanesh useful precisely because the Dark Prince was predictable. Show someone perfection, and they will pursue it. Show them transcendence, and they will reach for it. Show them the path to excess, and they will walk it willingly. These were constants Slaanesh could calculate around, variables that remained stable while everything else changed. The great game continued as it always had, as it always would. Four gods competing for supremacy in a contest that could never be won because victory would mean stagnation, and stagnation meant death. They needed each other as much as they opposed each other, needed the conflict to sustain themselves, needed the eternal struggle because struggle was all they were. And throughout it all, Slaanesh hungered, schemed, corrupted, claimed. The gods' demons walked battlefields and palaces, whispered in the ears of artists and warriors, promised transcendence to those who had already lost their way. The keepers of secrets pursued their individual obsessions while serving their patrons' greater purpose. The demonettes harvested souls with predatory grace. The lesser daemons swarmed through cracks in reality, drawn by sensation like moths to flame, leaving corruption in their wake. But the era Indomitus had brought changes even Slaanesh could not fully control. The Primarch Rabute Guilliman had returned, the Lord Commander of the Imperium walking once more among the living, bringing with him the Primaris Space Marines and a renewed hope that humanity might yet survive the darkness closing around it. His Indomitus crusade pushed back against chaos incursions, reclaimed worlds thought lost, demonstrated that the Imperium was not yet defeated. Slaanesh regarded this development with interest rather than concern. Hope was merely desire directed toward the future. Aspiration was obsession waiting to mature. The Primarch's grand plans, his dreams of imperial renewal, his vision of humanity triumphant, were all potential sources of corruption. The higher one reached, the further one could fall. And Guilliman reached very high indeed. The Dark Prince was patient. The Imperium would exhaust itself in pursuit of victory. Its soldiers would become addicted to the glory of conquest. Its administrators would become obsessed with perfect efficiency. Its artists would celebrate triumph through excess that gradually became indistinguishable from heresy. All of this was inevitable. All of it fed Slaanesh, regardless of whether the Imperium succeeded or failed in its immediate goals. Victory and defeat were both equally delicious to she who thirsts. What mattered was the intensity of the pursuit, the obsession with the goal, the willingness to sacrifice everything in the name of an ideal. These were the doorways through which corruption entered, and the Imperium, for all its rhetoric about duty and sacrifice, was a civilization built entirely on obsession. Obsession with the Emperor, with purity, with humanity's supremacy, with survival at any cost. Every obsession was a thread Slaanesh could pull. Every excess was a weakness to exploit. Every moment when duty became fanaticism, when devotion became addiction, when the pursuit of victory consumed the reason for fighting, Slaanesh was there, waiting, offering, collecting. The Xeno species throughout the galaxy faced similar temptations. The Tau, with their philosophy of the greater good and their drive toward constant improvement, contained within their culture the seeds of Slaaneshi corruption. How long before the pursuit of the greater good became obsessive, before improvement became an addiction that tolerated no imperfection? The Tau claimed immunity to chaos through their weak warp presence, their limited psychic connection. They were wrong. Corruption did not require psychic sensitivity, it only required desire. And the Tau desired very much. The Orcs seemed immune through their fundamental simplicity. They wanted to fight, to win, to grow stronger. There was no sophistication in their desires, no refinement in their pursuits. But even Orcs occasionally fell to Slaanesh, usually those who became fixated on the perfect weapon or the ideal battle, who confused their species' natural drive for conflict with the obsessive pursuit that fed the Dark Prince. These were rare. Orcs were not prone to overthinking, but rare did not mean impossible. The Necrons, soulless machines animated by ancient consciousness, seemed beyond Slaanesh's reach, but even they had their vulnerabilities. Some Necron lords, driven mad by eons of sleep or corrupted by the Flare virus, had developed obsessions that resonated with Slaanesh's nature. They collected, they perfected, they pursued immortal goals with immortal patience, refining their methods across millions of years. The fact that they had no souls to claim did not mean they could not serve. Corruption took many forms. And the Tyranids, the great devourer, that galactic horror that consumed all biological matter in its path, seemed to exist in opposition to everything chaos represented. They had no individuality, no desires beyond consumption, no culture or art or obsession. They simply ate. And yet, there were those in the Imperium who studied the Tyranids with such intensity that the study itself became corruption. Magos Biologis, who sought to understand the hive mind, achieved such obsessive focus that they lost themselves, began to see the Tyranid approach to existence as elegantly perfect, began to believe that the simplicity of consumption without desire was a kind of transcendence. They were wrong, of course, but wrongness did not prevent damnation, perhaps enhanced it. And their souls, when claimed, carried the bitter flavor of irony that Slaanesh found particularly delectable. The galaxy turned. Wars were fought. Empires rose and fell. And through it all, Slaanesh endured, a constant presence, a patient predator, a hunger that could never be satisfied, but would never cease seeking satisfaction. The god had existed for 10,000 years and would exist for 10,000 more, for 100,000. For as long as sentient beings possessed the capacity for desire and the weakness to mistake obsession for passion, the Eldari remained the Dark Prince's particular obsession, the species that had birthed the god and now sought to destroy it. Slaanesh could not allow their escape, would not tolerate Yanid's success. The war for Eldari souls intensified, became personal in ways that wars between gods rarely achieved. This was not strategic competition but existential conflict. If Yanid fully awakened, if the god of the dead achieved sufficient power to challenge Slaanesh directly, the outcome was uncertain, and uncertainty was intolerable. Slaanesh began actively hunting the Ynnari, sending daemons specifically tasked with their destruction, corrupting Eldari who might oppose them, turning faction against faction. The craftworlds were divided on whether the Ynnari represented salvation or blasphemy. The Drukhari saw them as threats to Komorog's delicate balance, risking exposure of the Dark City to a god of the dead that might prove as dangerous as she who thirsts. The Exodites simply wanted the Ynnari to leave them alone, to stop demanding their participation in schemes that risked everything for uncertain reward. The conflict escalated. Yvraine survived assassination attempts that should have killed her dozens of times over. The Incarni manifested with increasing frequency, growing stronger with each appearance, gathering more souls, channeling more power toward Yanid's nascent consciousness. The Vizark, the Ynnari's greatest warrior, cut through Slaaneshi daemons with a sword that was both weapon and holy relic, a blade that somehow injured daemons in ways they could not regenerate from. Slaanesh was losing ground, slowly, incrementally, but measurably. And the Dark Prince, for whom loss was novel and victory assumed, found the experience strangely exhilarating. This was challenge. This was opposition worthy of the god's attention. This was, in its own way, the most intense experience Slaanesh had felt since the moment of birth. The hunger deepened, the obsession intensified. Slaanesh wanted the Eldari, not despite their resistance, but because of it. Their defiance made them more desirable. Their struggle made their eventual consumption more satisfying. Every soul that escaped to Winid was another motivation to claim the rest. Every Ynnari victory was fuel for the god's determination to prove supremacy. It was, the Dark Prince realized, love, twisted, destructive, consuming love. Slaanesh loved the Eldari the way a predator loves prey, the way fire loves fuel, the way hunger loves the feast. Their suffering was exquisite. Their hope was delicious. Their souls were seasoned by 10,000 years of fear and desperation and defiance. They were the perfect meal, the ideal offering, the ultimate satisfaction that could never quite satisfy. And so the cycle continued, would continue, must continue. Because to stop would be to admit satiation, and satiation was death for a being whose identity was hunger itself. The galaxy bled, civilizations fell, souls were harvested by the billions, and Slaanesh, eternal and insatiable, presided over it all with the smile of a satisfied predator who knew satisfaction was impossible. The god had everything and needed more, had consumed countless trillions and remained famished, had achieved divinity and found it insufficient, This was not tragedy. This was nature. Slaanesh was hunger given form and consciousness, desire made divine, obsession elevated to cosmic principle. The god could no more cease hungering than gravity could cease pulling or time could cease flowing. It was fundamental, essential, inescapable. In the palace of pleasure, in the realm beyond reality where sensation ruled and physics was merely one option among many, Slaanesh reclined on thrones of twisted flesh and laughed at a joke only the god understood. The Eldari fought for their freedom. Humanity struggled against corruption. The Inari believed they could birth salvation. The Imperium believed it could endure. The Xenos believed they were immune. They were all wrong. They were all right. It did not matter. All paths led to the same destination eventually. All resistance was temporary. All victories were Pyrrhic. All civilizations were merely courses in an infinite meal. Some would be consumed today, others tomorrow. Still others in millennia yet unwritten. But all would be consumed, all would feed the hunger, all would discover that their excellence was excess, their passion was obsession, their desires were chains they had forged themselves. This was Slaanesh's promise and curse, to offer transcendence and deliver damnation, to promise perfection and provide only endless pursuit, to give everyone exactly what they wanted and make them wish they had never asked. The hunger was unending, the feast was eternal, and the galaxy, vast and teeming with life, would provide for millennia to come. New species would arise, new obsessions would form, new excesses would bloom like flowers in a garden where beauty and horror were indistinguishable. Slaanesh waited, hungered, smiled. She who thirsts would never be satisfied. But the god would also never stop seeking satisfaction, and in that eternal seeking, that endless hunger, that infinite pursuit of the impossible, lay the Dark Prince's truest nature. Not a being, not a consciousness, but a force, a principle-given divinity, the embodiment of every flaw that made sentience both glorious and damned, the proof that excellence could become excess, that passion could become obsession, that the highest heights humanity and all species could achieve were merely different routes to the same damnation. The story of Slaanesh had no ending because hunger had no ending. The chronicle could not conclude because desire could not be satisfied. The tale would continue as long as thinking beings existed to desire, to obsess, to pursue perfection beyond the bounds of reason. 10,000 years had passed, 10,000 more would come, and throughout it all, in the deep warp and the spaces between moments, in the whisper that promised transcendence and the touch that delivered corruption, Slaanesh would endure, eternal, insatiable, inevitable, the hunger unending.